God is the center of the religion, then man becomes a servant to a master. And if morality is the center, then man becomes a responsible actor. For him, spiritual emancipation, therefore, is the process of becoming a moral being through self-effort rather than some sort of a divine grace. So he's kind of completely de-emphasizing the position of God. He's expecting his followers not to look up to some sort of a divine grace, but to actualize their spiritual abilities through self-effort. Namo Buddhaya, everyone. And thank you for the very kind introduction. I'd like to start my talk by thanking the organizers of this conference for inviting me, and in particular I would like to thank Professor Somshekhar. He's the one who got in touch with me and invited me to speak at this conference. Before I proceed, let me just start with a disclaimer. It gives me a lot of joy and pleasure to be part of this conference in an academic setting like this. But unfortunately, I'm not an academic in the same sense that you guys are all. You're studying Dr. Ambedkar's, Baba Saheb's, the intent of his thoughts, the intent of his speeches, the intent of his writings. I haven't had the good fortune of exploring the intent of his works to the same extent that you have or do it on a regular basis. But nevertheless, I have a perspective on some of the things that we've learned from Baba Saheb. So I'm going to just present my views. So my talk actually explores three themes. So I start off by exploring Baba Saheb Ambedkar's the specific spiritual dimensions of his individual philosophy, and the kind of path that his spiritual quest took in his initial years, in his formative years, and in the later years of his life. And then use that as a foundation to articulate Dr. Ambedkar's vision for what he called a spiritual society. So all of you are aware that he had a very specific kind of vision for India. He called it Enlightened India. So what exactly does he mean? What was his vision for this spiritual society? So that's the second theme that I'm going to explore in my talk. And then use this as a foundation to reflect on a parallel, a complementary interpretation that is embedded in a popular mantra that Baba Saheb gave us. So you're all familiar with the mantra. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the mantra. So I'm going to talk about that mantra, and I'll kind of emphasize the spiritual dimensions of that mantra. So we all kind of equate that mantra with a socio-political mantra, but how we can, it is deeply embedded in his thoughts, in his writings, in his speeches, a spiritual kind of dimension to this mantra, and how we can use that as a methodology to further our individual spiritual liberation. So that's going to be the crux of my talk. So before I begin the talk, I think it would be a good occasion. It's a very good occasion for us to begin the talk with an invocation that Baba Saheb Ambedkar included in his book, The Buddha and His Dhamma, in the epilogue section of his text, The Buddha and His Dhamma. The prayer, as you, all of you may be aware of, it's called A Prayer for His Return to His Native Land. So, for the sake of auspiciousness, maybe I'll chant or rather recite Just some extracts from the prayer. So the prayer says, O Exalted One, I trust myself wholeheartedly to the Tathagat whose light pervades all the 10 directions. So he's paying homage to a Tathagat, Buddha Amitabha. And then the prayer kind of unfolds. So I'll just read out a couple of points from the prayer which are pertinent to our talk here. So he says, I express my earnest desire to be born in thy land. And let me pray that all beings, having been born here, shall proclaim the truth like Buddha thyself. And that I could, together with all my fellow beings, attain the birth in the land of bliss. So this land of bliss that is being spoken of here is reference to a specific Buddha field. It's called Sukhavati, and it is the land or the pure land of Buddha Amitabha. So this prayer is actually an invocation presented at the start of a commentary by Acharya Vasubandhu. So it's a commentary on the Sukhavati Vyoga Sutra. And Dr. Ambedkar, Baba Saheb, quotes it in such a way that Vasubandhu's aspiration to attain rebirth in this pure land, along with all his fellow beings, to proclaim the truth like Buddha Amitabha himself, becomes an heartfelt aspiration of Baba Saheb himself to be reborn in his native land. And by native land, I believe he is referring to his Karma Bhumi, India, and to continue his work for the revival of Buddhism in India. So this prayer, Baba Saheb included for a very specific reason at the end of the Buddha and his Dhamma. So in his opinion, in his eyes, there was a lot of unfinished work that he still had to attend to. And it's in response to that sentiment that he reproduced this prayer. So you note that this prayer talks about return to one's own karma bhumi. So unlike the spiritual ideals of other traditional spiritual systems, unlike the traditional saints who sought moksha or escape from the cycle of birth, the Ambedkarite spiritual path is one of return. So the prayer for return, what it does is it highlights his deep love for his karma bhumi, which is India, and it also reflects at the same time a Buddhist ideal which can be called as aspiration for non-abiding nirvana. So there's the emphasis on non-abiding. What it means is that although you have the ability to actualize the state of nirvana, you postpone it, prolong it, and you work as a bodhisattva for the benefit of all sentient beings. So he wished to be reborn not out of any kind of attachment to the pleasures of this existence, but out of compassion to continue the struggle that he had initiated, he had taken up during his entire life, until the very last person is liberated from the shackles of suffering in samsara. And this is reflected in another part of the text that again is included in the toward the end of the text. So there's this prayer that is reproduced again, or a vow. It's called a vow to spread his dharma. So the vow says, again I'll just read out a couple of points from the vow. It says, there are beings without limit, so there are infinite beings, and let us take the vow to convey them all across. Across what? Across this ocean of suffering in samsara. And then at the end of the vow, that section which is in the form of a vow to spread his dhamma, he says there is a way of Buddha without comparison. So it is unparalleled, it is peerless, and let us take the vow to accomplish it perfectly. So the latter part of the vow speaks about an aspiration to become a completely enlightened Buddha. But the first part, which is the more critical operational part of the vow, it presents the purpose with which you want to actualize this aspiration, which is to work for the welfare of all beings without limit. So it is with this aspiration that Baba Sahib conducted his public life. And he left behind, as we are all aware of, a very remarkable legacy. His legacy, as is being discussed here as part of this conference, it influenced nearly every foundational pillar of modern India. So his expertise was not restricted to just law, but he was a pioneering economist, as was being discussed in the previous session. I just could gather some points from the discussion. He was a transformation labor leader, a visionary in infrastructure, and a revolutionary social philosopher. Yet, his life's work was fundamentally a spiritual quest. And the quest was to reclaim human personality. So he, right from a very young age, he embraced spirituality. And through the practice of spirituality that he engaged in, he sought to rescue spirituality from the clutches of superstition and what he called the supernatural. So for him, just like his guru, Shakyamuni Buddha, spirituality was to be sought not in some sort of abstract divinity, but right here in the midst of humanity. So spirituality is about humanity and not about divinity. And because of this belief, he sought to build what he called a spiritual society. And for him, what he believed is that a society cannot be spiritual just by constructing temples or having a lot of priests attending the deities in those temples. But spiritual society has to be defined by the quality of moral relationships between the people who inhabit that society, who make up that society. So he sought to build a society like this, where spirituality was not some sort of a vague retreat to the supernatural, but it was actually a practical social morality that governed how humans treated one another. And his spiritual society, as most of you would be familiar with this term, he termed it as Enlightened India or Prabuddha Bharat. So his vision of Prabuddha Bharat, that it had some very unique, specific kind of features. So I'll just highlight some I'll speak of four foundational features that could describe his vision for a spiritual society. So the first one was to have a spiritual society or a society that could be characterized as something that promotes what he called social endosmosis. So what he envisioned was to create a fluid society, a society where there was a free and fluid flow of interests and sympathies across all groups of this society. And he had this vision to build this spiritual society along the lines of some sort of a social democracy. But very importantly, this democracy that he envisioned, he said that it is essentially an attitude of respect and reverence towards your fellow men. So that's how he is describing democracy. He's saying it's not merely a form of government, but it is essentially an attitude of respect and reverence towards fellow men. And I would extend this a little bit, this argument, to include not just humans, but even non-humans. You have to extend reverence and respect even to the animals and other sentient beings that cohabit this realm with us. So one needs to cultivate an attitude of respect and reverence to all our sentient beings. Now, by using the word reverence and respect, he elevated this social interaction that he expected to be the main feature of the spiritual society. He elevated that social interaction to a level of sacred duty. So, it is the sacred duty of any Buddhist follower, any follower who practices Buddhism, to conduct his or her spiritual practice in such a way that cherishes others' welfare. So, others' welfare becomes primary. The other foundational pillar of this spiritual society that he envisioned was replacing God with morality. So, in his spiritual vision, there was no space for God. So, he said if God is the center of the religion, then man becomes a servant to a master. And if morality is the center, then man becomes a responsible actor. For him, spiritual emancipation, therefore, is the process of becoming a moral being through self-effort rather than some sort of a divine grace. So he's kind of completely de-emphasizing the position of God. He's expecting his followers not to look up to some sort of a divine grace, but to actualize their spiritual abilities through self-effort. And he says that morality does not require the sanction of any kind of God. It is practiced because it is good for human welfare. That is it. You don't need to look beyond any other quality to realize that this should be the central pillar of a spiritual society. And then the third foundational pillar that he envisioned for his spiritual society was this triad of liberty, equality, and fraternity. There was some reference to these three principles in the previous discussion also. So he maintained that his social philosophy was not derived from some Western political science concepts, but was rooted in the teachings of the Buddha himself, where he spoke about equality in spiritual terms. So he believed that the equality was a spiritual necessity because every human has the same potential for enlightenment. So that's how he posited the equality amongst all sentient beings. So this is something that we call the Buddha essence or the Tathagat Garbha, which is present in all sentient beings, not just humans, but even non-humans. But he also felt that one has to promote a spirit of interconnectedness between the various constituents of the society. One has to realize the interconnectedness amongst the different constituents of the society. And he argued that liberty and equality are not going to prosper, thrive. They're going to be unstable without the third constituent of this triad, which is fraternity. So fraternity provides what he called a fellow feeling that prevents one person from dominating another. And then there's the fourth foundational pillar that he emphasized for this spiritual society, and that is the practice of loving kindness or maitri. So maitri is fellowship that is again not restricted to just human beings. It's an immeasurable attitude of loving kindness, which wishes that all sentient beings be happy and be united with the causes of happiness. And he felt that it is absolutely imperative for inhabitants of this spiritual society to further the practice of maitri. And he emphasized what is called the practice of the metta bhavana, meditation on loving kindness. So by wishing for the well-being of all sentient beings, an individual is transformed and he then becomes the agent who organizes the spirit of the entire community. So for him, the individual becomes the agency for this peace and happiness that a spiritual society should have. And it is through this human agency that he intended his spiritual society to be established. And he called this spiritual society, as we just saw, he called this spiritual society Prabuddha Bharat. Prabuddha meaning enlightened India. So here is how Dr. Ambedkar defines the individual's responsibility in this spiritual architecture that he envisioned. So the first necessity for the individual is to assert his human agency is to reject the role of any kind of passive recipient of divine grace or fate. As we had seen, he had completely de-emphasized the role of a supernatural God to describe the spiritual society. And he'd asked his disciples to not look for an external savior or a mokshadatta, but look to genuine margadatas. And he had identified Shakyamuni Buddha as the most genuine kind of margadatas. And he also said that the individual is responsible for his or her own salvation. He often quoted the Buddha's mantra again, which says, Atta Deepa Bhava. Some translations translate it as be your own, be a lamp unto yourself. Some say be a refuge unto yourself or an island unto yourself. So a spiritual society cannot exist if members are mentally dependent on supernatural forces or supermen. So Dr. Ambedkar exhorted his followers to build their individual capacities by realizing the centrality of this mantra, which is being a lamp unto oneself. And while he was advising his followers, his fellow beings, on how to put this into practice, he gave us this very powerful mantra, a very famous mantra, which you're all aware of. It says, educate, agitate, and organize. So I believe embedded within this mantra is Baba Saheb's advice for spiritual upliftment to his fellow seekers of spirituality. So the mantra, educate, agitate, organize, it is traditionally understood as a socio-political mobilization, but when it is viewed through the prism of the spiritual quest and the spiritual philosophy of Dr. Ambedkar, which is quite evident when you look at the later years of his life, it can also be interpreted as some sort of a complementary, parallel spiritual interpretation. So this interpretation transforms the mantra into a methodology for individual spiritual advancement from just being a tool for social revolution. So let us just briefly look at the three dimensions of this mantra individually. So the first one is educate. For him, educate implies cultivation of what he called prajna or wisdom. And what is the prajna that he was asking us to cultivate? To see reality as it is, stripped of any kind of delusions of ordinary existence. So this is all at the level of the individual. The individual has to realize that he's got this wonderful capacity to become enlightened or become a Buddha, to become a Tathagat, the Tathagat Garbha that abides in any sentient being. So one needs to educate oneself about this potency. So for him, education or educate never really meant acquiring a conventional degree or profession. It was the essential first act of a mental revolution. And in the context of spiritual upliftment, education is the process of cultivating insights into the true nature of reality or prajna. And to free yourselves, free your mental disposition from the distortions of ego, from the distortions of any kind of superstition, from the distortion of superimpositions. So for spiritual upliftment, educate actually entails four specific dimensions. So the first one is, educate will take us from what is called a state of avidya to prajna. So avidya is the greatest obstacle to a spiritual attainment. Avidya is some sort of a wrong vision of reality. It is not just lack of facts, not knowing something, but it is actually a misknowing of things. So in his discourse on Pratitya Samutpad, Shakyamuni Buddha spoke about 12 different links of the Pratitya Samutpad of origination, dependent origination. And he says the first one is avidya, and he says avidya, avidya pache sankhara, sankhara pache vijnan, vijnan pache namarup. So the first link is the link of avidya. So it is important for us to realize this and then educate ourselves to remove the cognitive error that binds us to conventional appearances, and that then leads to inferior worldly pursuits, like most of us are kind of engaged in. So, to educate is also to unlearn something that we have been conditioned to. And it is unlearning to eliminate this cognitive error that is inherent to our ordinary being. Education is also the cultivation of a right perspective. So, in that sense, you could actually think of educate correlating with the Eightfold Noble Path. The first two of those first two steps of the Eightfold Noble Path, right view and right resolve. So, right view is the equivalent of being educated. It is the ability to see through avidya, whereas right resolve, once having educated one's mind, one must then resolve to act on that knowledge. So, this is the spiritual aim to abandon afflictions and ego and to work for others' welfare. So, educate helps us with awakening from ignorance, avidya. It helps us to free ourselves from what is called mental slavery. So, Dr. Ambedkar asked his followers to study their history to understand slavery. He also kind of asked his followers to study their own mind to understand mental slavery. And we are all slaves to our own delusions, our own anger, our own attachment, greed, pride, jealousy, all the other afflictions. So he asked us to look inwards into our own mind and understand the slavery nature, that we are slave to these kind of afflictions. So he wanted us to understand mental slavery. The second thing that educate helps us to do is lead us onto the path of intellectual autonomy. So most spiritual traditions demand blind faith in a guru or in some sort of a text, whereas Baba Saheb's education demands the opposite, the use of reason as the ultimate light. So education entails subjecting every religious claim to the test of logic and social utility. So he wanted his followers to follow a religion that had a scientific temper for precisely this reason. Educate also helps us free ourselves from mental colonization, unlearn the myths that keep the mind in a state of fear. And then you realize that your spiritual upliftment and other forms of upliftment depend on your own actions rather than some divine grace. And it also helps us cultivate social consciousness, the principle of social endosmosis, which he advocated for the spiritual society. For him, there's no private spirituality. To be spiritually educated is to understand one's relations to others, realize that one's well-being is dependent on the well-being of the entire community. It is tied to the well-being of the entire sentient kind, not just even the human community. So this wisdom, if you collect this wisdom through education, it transforms our personal growth into some sort of a social responsibility. And we educate ourselves so that you can better agitate for change and organize for fraternity. So the second dimension of the mantra is agitate, which is a reference to the inner revolution of will and intention that he advocated for his spiritual friends, fellow men. So ordinarily, agitation is associated with the concept of protest, but in a spiritual context, it is a holy restlessness. I have some more time?
Yes.
Yeah? Sorry? Okay. Okay, so agitate implies some sort of a holy restlessness or some vague or some wage. It's kind of alternately translated as some wage or some wage. So, what it implies is there's some sort of a friction that occurs when a newly educated mind refuses to live in an old oppressive reality. So, in spiritual terms, agitation would lead to the realization of the unsatisfactory nature of our present existence. So, if you realize the inherent unsatisfactoriness of our present existence, then you would develop an attitude of wanting to renounce it. So, this is an attitude of renunciation, or it's called nekhamma or naishkramya. So, agitation is the spiritual struggle against one's own ego, one's own internalized habits of submission to your afflictions. So, what does one do when one agitates? It provides us with some sort of a spiritual fuel. Once we've realized that there's the inherent nature of our being is unsatisfactory, and it provides a fuel for sustained practice. And we need this kind of fuel, which is in the form of a discontent with the present state of being. We need this discontent to move forward towards liberation. So it provides us the drive that the person needs towards a life of freedom and dignity. And agitation also refers to agitation against our own laziness, our own fears, and our own prejudices. So, spiritual agitation requires the individual to resist the urge to find a savior. Once we have realized, we have educated ourselves of our potency and our the true nature of reality, the true nature of the self. There are two options that the person has. In order to advance on the spiritual path, he could look at some external force to guide him, or alternatively take the responsibility on oneself. So, spiritual agitation requires the individual to resist this urge to find an external mokshadatta, and instead take the difficult path of being one's own savior. And the third dimension of the mantra is the aspect of or the practice of organizing. So, what does organization mean? It is organizing one's own internal psychological and philosophical ramps. So, organize is the practice of bringing order to the chaotic self, and also working for the harmony in an otherwise unharmonious or divergent and divided society. And the structural application of Maitri and practice is what is practice of the paramitas, like generosity, is what is emphasized here as the essential agent that can help us create this organization, actualize this organization. So, to organize spiritually means to align one's thoughts, speech, and actions, because an unorganized mind is a slave to one's own impulses. A spiritually organized person is one who has achieved self-mastery, and it is this internal organization that will help that individual to remain calm and purposeful in the face of any kind of external oppression. So, this is the internal organization. Now, you need to also work on some external organization, and for that external organization, Baba Sahib advocated the use of Maitri or loving kindness as the ultimate organizational force. As we had seen, Maitri is about fraternity, building fraternity. It is a fellow feeling that presupposes absolute equality between the constituents, all constituents of the society. So, organizing fellowship through Maitri, and this is how the mantra educate, agitate, and organize moves from the individual to the collective through the agency of Maitri, through the agency of this third element, organize, which has again two aspects to it: individual internal organization and collective organization. And organization also requires us to be very mindful about how we communicate. So, right speech from the Eightfold Noble Path spiritual organization requires speech that is truthful, fraternal, and free from any kind of language of exclusion. It also requires, organization also requires us to engage in right action, which is the practice of Maitri, and right livelihood. Because if spiritual society was based on the principles of exploitation, which is what modern societies exhibit, then it is impossible to realize this vision of enlightened society, Prabuddha society. So organizing one's life means choosing a livelihood that does not harm other sentient beings and promotes the common good. So it is through this vision, through this mantra of educate, agitate, and organize, and through his vision of what a spiritual society looks like, should be, that Dr. Ambedkar has advised us, all the individuals, to emulate his guru, the Buddha. So it is through this kind of practice that we can shift our focus from waiting for some passive kind of, waiting passively for some sort of a salvation or emancipation, but instead kind of actively walking the path. So the ultimate goal of Dr. Ambedkar's spiritual emancipation, as we had discussed at the top of the session, is to attain a specific kind of nirvana. And this nirvana is, he redefined this nirvana as not some sort of an escape from existence, but as a state of peace and justice on earth, in this very realm, in this very time. So for Dr. Ambedkar, there was no separation between the political and the spiritual. A person cannot be spiritually free if they are socially enslaved, and they cannot be socially free if they are mentally enslaved by their afflictive myths. And as far as the legacy of the Prabuddha Bharat goes, Dr. Ambedkar's vision was to create a Prabuddha Bharat where every individual has realized his or her own human potential. So he taught us that, like he had said in his prayer for his return to his land, he qualified it further through his writings. He says that he does not expect us to look for his return in a mystical sense. He said that he returns every time an individual, a follower of his, educates his or her mind to see equality, agitates against the ego's bias, and organizes his or her own spirit through Maitri. So this is the Bodhisattva's aspiration, to work for all the sentient beings. He has to educate himself, he has to agitate against his own internal delusions, against his own biases, and then organize through the force of Maitri. So by adapting this mantra for our own spiritual practice, we fulfill our responsibility to the Dhamma. So just to conclude, spiritual emancipation in Dr. Ambedkar's view, in the Ambedkarite sense, it's not a static vision. It is an ongoing, dynamic kind of process of becoming what. So spiritual emancipation is the process of becoming a new person. And what kind of new person did he want all of us to become? He wanted us to become rational. He wanted us to become courageous, to take on our own internal delusions, and to be deeply connected to others through the bond of Maitri. So the prayer for his return is ultimately answered when we become this new person. So in that sense, spiritual emancipation, it's not a destination, it is an ongoing process, it is a continuous practice of associated living. It's an ongoing practice of associated living that honors the dignity of all. So this is the unfinished work that Baba Sahib has entrusted to us. So let us all be mindful about this responsibility that Baba Sahib has given us, and let's conduct our practice, our lives, in line with the vision that he's articulated in his spiritual philosophy, in his vision of spiritual society, and also through the mantra that he had given, the mantra of educate, agitate, and organize. Okay, thank you. So I'll stop here. Thank you. Thank you very much.